Сайн байцгаана уу хүнд үзэгчдээ. Өнөөдөр манай де факто нэвтрүүлгийн зочноор олон улсын валютын сангийн Монголыг хариуцсан ажлын хэсгийн дарга хатагтай Ангана Банержи оролцож байна.
Ангана Банержи олон улсын валютын сангийн Монгол Улсыг хариуцсан ажлын хэсгийн ахлагч. Колумбийн их сургуулийг олон улсын эдийн засгийн доктор, эдийн засгийн ухааны магистр зэрэгтээ тус төгссөн. Нью Дели дэх Жавахарлал Неру их сургуулийг эдийн засгийн ухааны магистр, Калькуттагийн их сургуульд эдийн засаг математикийн мэрэгчлэр бакалаврын зэрэг хамгаалсан. Тонга, Кипр, Сан Марино, Нидерландын Антилийн арлуудыг хариуцсан ажлын хэсгийн дараагаар олон улсын валютын санд ажиллаж исэн. 2019-с 2021 онуудад Аз номхон далайн газарт ахлах эдийн засагчаар ажиллаж ижээ. Олон улсын валютын сангийн стратеги бодлогын газарт ажиллаж явах хугацаанд Албан улс, Болгар улсын санхүүгийн доктортой байдал, банкны бүтцийн шинжилгээний асуудлыг хариуцсан ажиллаж исэн. Олон улсын валютын санд Монгол Улсыг хариуцсан ажлын хэсгийн дараагаар 2021 оноос хойш томилогдсон ажиллаж байна.
Good evening.
Thank you for having me here.
Thank you very much being with us. Let's talk about your trip, your first trip after 2 years passing. Please let us know what is your main conclusion of this trip.
So I recently became the Mongolia mission chief in May 2021. But even though we have not been here physically for 2 years, that doesn't mean that we have not been working very closely with the central bank and the government over long distance and remote connections over the last 2 years. We have a very good office here that also helps us stay in close contact with the authorities. But it's much better to be here in person and actually have face-to-face discussions because you learn much more this way. The purpose of our visit was to update our assessment of the economy of Mongolia after we did the Article 4 mission in 2021. Unfortunately, the pandemic was still going on, so we had to do that virtually. But our report from that time is public, and we are here now to update our economic assessment and continue the ongoing dialogue with the government and the central bank that has not lapsed despite the COVID. So our assessment of the economy, when we came in November 2021, we thought Mongolia would have a big boom year this year because commodity prices were supposed to be very high, and we expected the economy to be growing at 7% this year. At that time, we had noted that there would be downside risks to the economy. Unfortunately, every single one of those have materialized at the same time, and there are new risks. And by that we mean China's border closures have lasted a lot longer, and now we expect it to last at least until the end of the year. And there's the war in Ukraine, which is creating its own problems. And global high prices in food and oil is affecting every country in the world, but also Mongolia, because it imports a lot of food and oil, and all of its oil from also the crisis countries. So in that context, we have now downgraded our growth outlook from 7% to 1%. The outlook is for stagflation, and we expect inflation to also remain quite high. On average, our current forecast is 14.5% for this year, but a lot will also depend on how the government and the central bank conduct policies. So these numbers are not hard and fast. Our current forecasts assume that we hope that the China border closure issues and the war in Ukraine are resolved by the end of this year, but that's not certain. So while for now we expect and we hope that things can improve next year, and with the borders opening, Mongolia can actually reap the benefits of the very high commodity prices, we are not fully sure that will happen. So the downside risks remain very much there. On top of that, 2023 was always going to be a difficult year for Mongolia because a lot of external debt is coming due that year. So this is why the policy discussions and the assessment of the economic outlook and risks have become taken on a larger importance than they would have otherwise. That said, if all these risks mitigate, and we don't know when they will, Mongolia's medium-term growth potential is still strong, 6%. It's just that at this point it's very hard to know when they can reap that potential, because right now the factors that are getting in the way of them reaching high growth is outside their control. So for now, the outlook is stagflation with large downside risks.
Mm-hmm. When we talk about the stagflation, so inflation comes with the slowdown of the economy together, both. Yeah. So let's talk about that in particular, because through this whole 2 years of COVID, though, in human terms, Mongolia is relatively very savvy approach. But in economic terms, like many other countries, we have a big problem. One of the reasons of this stagnation comes. That's why my question is: there was a law that gave special right to the government from the parliament to spend as much they needed in a direct way, say, and yet the government have stopped all these restrictions in connection with the COVID, but the other law is not stopped. Still, it is in function. Why is that?
Well, this is something that is a question for the government, why they decided to extend the anti-pandemic, what we call the COVID law, the anti-pandemic law, to end 2022. And the parliament decided to extend that even before the war in Ukraine had started. Mm-hmm. Our concern about this law is twofold. Mm-hmm. One part of it is that some of the measures in this law affect the central bank's ability to control inflation. Mm-hmm. Because some of these measures, instead of going through the government's budget, are parked in the central bank's budget. And we think this is not a good idea, no matter what the economic situation is, because the central bank needs to have all the freedom to influence inflation and its independence. So we have for a long time argued that any of these support measures should be transparently provided through the budget and not through the central bank. So that's a permanent problem that we have had, and we hope that this will be addressed. The second concern we have is a number of these measures, including measures that are provided through the budget to support the economy, are necessary, but they're untargeted, and I'll explain in a minute. Mm-hmm. And so therefore, in the end, they become too costly. Mm-hmm. So we really think the government has done the right thing in moving very early to support the vulnerable and the ones who are feeling the economic hardship. But the program designs, including some of the safety net designs that are financed by the budget, as well as all the programs that are in the anti-pandemic law, they don't discriminate between those who need the money, like the vulnerable, and those who can afford to pay their own mortgages. They don't need a subsidy. The rich don't need a mortgage subsidy, not even during the pandemic.
Exactly.
So we had always suggested that all the support should be either not be provided in the form of a law and the anti-pandemic law, mm-hmm. because changing a law is always harder, mm-hmm. whereas when it's in part of the budget or part of the central bank's, it's easier for the central bank to be more flexible in addressing inflation, and it's easier for the fiscal to manage fiscal support, but it's harder to overturn a law. So for us, even last year, if you look at our report from last year, we told them to let the anti-pandemic law expire at the end of 2021. Uh-huh. And just provide support directly to the banking system. Uh-huh. And so we were surprised and a bit disappointed that the law got extended to the end of 2022. And especially now, given that the pandemic is over, that kind of support may no longer be needed.
Exactly. That's one of the reasons probably why we have inflation. A lot of money when the things is not created on one side, but there's still money, the purchasing power is still kept at that way. One of the reasons that we think. The other thing is the current exchange rate, devaluation of Mongolian tugrix. Now it's over 3,000. I mean, they kept it for 4 almost years at the level of 2,800 somehow. So what is the reason behind of this devaluation? How you see in near terms?
So I think I saw 2 questions. So I want to address one part of the comments that you made. So for now, when we look at the inflation data, we see that a lot of it, almost all of it is basically due to how the global prices are moving. So those are what is being reflected in Mongolia's inflation. But you're right that a lot of the support measures that have already been pumped into the economy untargeted. For the rich people, it's sitting in bank deposits. And during the pandemic, they didn't spend it. And they may spend it now when the restrictions are removed and the border travel is possible. So this will put demand pressure into an economy at a time when there are supply restrictions. So when there are fewer goods that are being supplied and demand picks up suddenly, that can be inflationary. So this is why we have been one of our messages to the government is be very careful what kind of stimulus you're putting into the economy, because the budget has to play a role and help the central bank and together with this monetary policy and exchange rate policy to contain inflation. Because inflation is the biggest tax and hurts the poor the most. Pumping money out to the rich and the poor will end up causing more inflation, which will then hurt the poor, and it would be counterproductive. So we can talk about the details a little bit later, but let me now answer your question on the exchange rate. So another constant advice we have given to the central bank is that Mongolia is, if you look at the structure of its economy and its debt, it's highly exposed to the external environment. So in that, and it's a small economy, in that environment, it's better to have a flexible exchange rate. Because when the exchange rate is flexible, it helps to absorb external shocks by creating incentives for the private sector to manage their external debt better, and it also compresses import demand. So it manages the economic pressures better. So in hindsight, we've been telling the central bank for a few years that they should be making the exchange rate more flexible.
And yet they have been pumping out a lot US dollars, and our reserve was 4.9 a year before. Now it's on the 3, even less now, even less than more than $1 billion less, I understand. And this is even more pressure for them to keep that rate in that level. So if they will put it now free, flexible, what will happen? The money will even more devalued.
So first of all, we support the central bank's recent moves to allow some greater flexibility. In general, flexibility is something that should be started in good times and bad times, so that by the time there are bad times, people are used to handling flexibility. So at this point, if all policies move in the same direction, like fiscal policy, then and communication around the exchange rate policy is good and effective. Greater exchange rate flexibility could lead to a weaker currency, but it could be manageable.
That's what we expect, in particular at the time when the price for fuel comes. With Russia, we're still trading, and they are not opposing us, not opposing us to pay in rubles. But things go, the trade goes more or less okay. we're 100% dependent on Russia food. That's one of the reasons why we have this political stand on that issue of the war. Now let's talk about the government. In spite of all this, they try their best to fight corruption, for example. They have raised an issue of a bad loan of Development Bank of Mongolia. You're very well aware of what's going on there, and now people, as they start fist stronger, they start to pay more. Those who were ignoring even to pay, politically connected, etc. How do you see the future of Development Bank of Mongolia, having in mind what's happened now?
So the issue of the Development Bank of Mongolia is rather unfortunate, because this was one of the issues that triggered the previous IMF program in 2017.
Exactly.
At that time, the law governing DBM was improved, but unfortunately it was not enforced properly. What we are very pleased about is that the central bank did its job and found the NPLs. We are also supportive of the fact that the parliamentary working group is trying to get to the bottom of it. The way we would now like to think about DBM is on two tracks. One is whatever the situation is now, which is a culmination of past events, and then the future of DBM. So when it comes to how to handle the situation right now, our advice has been that no matter how good a job the BOM and the parliamentary working group have been doing, it may be better for the government to hire an external advisor who is skilled at looking into these things, that could do a diagnostic review of DBM to understand the full scale of the problem. This requires a certain type of expertise that may not be available among parliamentary working group members or at the BOM. And it also provides some level of objectivity to the numbers, because it's sensitive, right? Once that number and the reasons why some of the issues happen are clearer, then it is easier to address the NPL problem. The Prime Minister and the efforts that are ongoing right now to deal with it through fraudulent activities, to try to recoup NPLs, these are all very good efforts. We have no problems with that. We hope they succeed. But we are not always sure that the government can fully recoup all the NPLs in the time it wants to, because it is complicated. So on the dealing with the past or whatever the problems of DBM, what we have said to the government is our principle is do not throw good money into solving, putting into old problems. And that is a principle that has to be respected.
Yet the Prime Minister said once, I remember, that we will not distract this bank. We will make it into the Exim Bank.
So that's my second track. As I said, DBM, we think about it in two tracks. The past, that has to be resolved. And an important part of the past is there are many debts due next year in 2023. Yes. That if they can't recoup from NPL and pay, then the budget should transparently pay it. It is not something that should be put on the central bank's balance sheet or someone else's balance sheet. The budget should own it, they guaranteed the debt, and they should pay it. Then the second track of DBM is the future of DBM. And there our message is also very clear, that if the governance problems at DBM are not effectively addressed, and at this point it's not clear how enforcement of a good law can be improved. It is not clear to us.
And
the second thing is, if it's not clear what the business model of development bank would be, because the government at the same time is trying to improve public investment management with the help of IMF support and other IFIs in the new Ministry of Economic Development. That is the best way to do in public investment management. In that framework, it's not clear what DBM's new role will be. So if these two issues are not clear, how DBM's governance going forward could be improved and what exactly should be the business model of DBM, then we have encouraged the government to consider putting the closure of DBM on the table as an option worth considering. Now, that's not going to be happening right away because NPLs and a lot of other things need to be resolved first. But it's a matter that the government has to seriously think about. Mm-hmm. We don't see any point of trying to improve public investment management on one hand and then keeping alive the DBM in a framework that gets messy and complicated. And our big concern is this has happened twice, 2017, and now at the worst possible time for Mongolia. And enough is enough.
Yes.
We should have no more fiscal risks from DBM into the budget in future.
Yeah, okay. Another issue you have also touched during your meetings with authorities was the issue of IPO of commercial banks. So please tell us your position, your advice on that.
Yes, so first of all, we think the banking reform strategy is a really good idea. Mm-hmm. Our only concern was this law was passed in early 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic. And the time frame and the ambition of the law was maybe a little too ambitious for the institutional structures and the conditions of Mongolia. So for the stock exchange is relatively thin, and so it may not be able to absorb all the shares in the time given.
In particular, when if ever all banks go one day to the...
Exactly.
That's almost the situation we are now facing.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so that was one issue we raised and we were concerned about. The other thing that we were concerned about is during the 2 years of the pandemic, there were many forbearance measures that were adopted, and it's not clear to us how they have affected the bank balance sheets. Uh-huh. We think some banks have managed this well. Uh-huh. We think some banks may not have managed this well. At the same time, because of the COVID situation, the central bank also could not do as close and on-site supervision as it usually does. So in our mind, the best and the safest way to implement this really good banking reform would have been to do an AQR, an asset quality review of the banks, of the 5 systemic banks, to figure out if everything is okay. Because in our view, the supervisors, which is the FRC, the Bank of Mongolia, and the stock exchange, they have to be very sure that when a bank does an IPO, that it is a sound bank, and that weak banks are not allowed to issue shares to the unsuspecting public. Because the last time this happened, shares were issued, yes, those banks turned out to be unsound. Yes. And can you imagine in a situation where there's so much economic uncertainty now and stagflation, if bad banks were to be forced to go and do IPOs, it could cause bigger headaches. So our advice to the Parliament has been to delay the IPO start deadline. If some good banks are able to do some IPO issues, they should go for it.
Well, in particular now when the head of the largest commercial bank is in prison.
Exactly.
And that's only just really urges. It will save money of future investors as well. So after properly making this AQR, should it be done by independent, foreign auditors, right? Yes. Only after that, then we will only discuss about the IPO. Otherwise, it will be really a lot of problems.
and the central bank had already started with the terms of reference, and they found a very good auditor interested. So our advice now is, first of all, it would be great if the Parliament delays the IPO deadline and doesn't force it in a way that is now in the current law. The second thing is the central bank should do the AQR, because even if the launch of the IPO is small, because all banks will do small amounts probably, by 2023, a lot of shares have to be issued in order for the shareholder diversification to take place in line with the law. So a lot of issuance is still to come. So the central bank needs to get its act together and do the AQR. If there are any problems, they need to resolve it in this time frame. So we are waiting to see what Parliament does, and we are helping the central bank with AQR, at least to help them do it well. And then once the results come, we will work with the central bank to help make sure that the IPO process is done properly. But we can't substitute for what the supervisors, the 3 supervisors in Mongolia have to do.
We expect this, first of all, central bank AQR report of each commercial bank before they will issue even IPO, either now or later. So thank you very much for this advice to the government, and I hope they will reconsider, because there is already a law adopted, so they need to reconsider it at the parliament level, which luckily they can do because they have a majority seats now. My final question about the tax reform. Recently the government suggested that it is also under the state austerity measures. They suggested they will have a different tax conditions for rural area and urban areas in order to address these congestions in Ulaanbaatar city. What is your take? I mean, for the first time they're going to make this different level of tax. What's your position on that?
So one area where we have been pushing for many years is progressive taxation, meaning higher income people pay more than lower income people. And to give you an example, on average in emerging markets, a personal income tax is about 27%. In Mongolia, it's 10%. So for all the spending that is demanded of the government, the amount of revenue the rich people contribute, who are the same, that gets the maximum benefit from all the child money program, it's inherently unfair. So we want, and we are very happy to hear that this may be an issue that the government is now going to be willing to tackle. So, and to introduce progressive income taxation, because Mongolia's, and we are going to help the government design it well. Now, they also asked us for assistance on how to design a law in a taxation system that would help with the decentralization. Our experts in our fiscal department at the IMF are going to study it and give them some assistance. And at that point, I'd rather leave it for them to do the assessment, because I'm not a fiscal tax expert. So I'm also waiting to hear what they would have to say, and then.
The final idea is, if you move your business to far away from Ulaanbaatar, where a lot of people concentrated, there will be way lower taxes in business terms, income terms, etc. And other also discounts, also more discount in mortgage, etc. The government is making another round of price stabilization program. When the first was introduced 10 years ago, the prices of many, in particular housing, just jumped 2 times higher. Do we expect, as a result, as we know as economists, you cannot make price by resolution or law? So what will be the reality, you think?
So when we looked at the law, it was not very clear to us how it would be implemented, but now we've had some discussions with them, and we understand that they're not thinking about price controls. In fact, we are very pleased that with all the oil price and energy price increases, they've allowed energy prices in Mongolia to reflect market prices. And we think it's a better way to do it, because when energy prices reflect real prices, then for those who can manage, at least they can conserve energy use. So in the end,
plan better.
So our understanding is that some of the price stability, the way the provisions of this law will work is through some support to some producers or importers, so that they can build up a stock.
Stock, yes. Reserve stock, how they call it.
Yeah. And the amounts that are under considerations are relatively small, so it should not be hugely problematic. So that's how we have understood it, but it remains to be seen how it's implemented.
So you think it's better to have, in some countries, they do price subsidizing. In this case, they are giving the producers discounted loan that the price comes at the market price. Which way usually is best?
So subsidizing prices is not recommended because it is usually very hard to take away. My own country, they had it for really many years, and it was very difficult to remove.
Once you introduce, then you cannot remove.
Yes.
People used to have this price, they want that price.
Exactly. It's much better to let the market prices be reflected and then support those who are badly affected with income support of a temporary nature.
Here we need a lot to
Yes.
introduce. As you said at the beginning, that it is untargeted. The government is spending a lot of money for social care, which became social assistance, by the way. And then when it's untargeted, a lot of money is spent with less results. So that's the concern. I'm so glad that you have addressed the issue with the government, and we have touched the major issues that I learned from the press about your visit.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for coming and sharing your knowledge with us, to the public. And hopefully your next visit in a year from now will bring different picture to the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We are deeply impressed by all the things the government and the central bank are trying to do. When we look at how well they handled the pandemic, if we see all the bigger countries are having a harder time with the pandemic.
Even now.
Yeah. And we see that it was possible because of how effectively the government worked, but also with the cooperation of the Mongolian people. Because if they didn't get vaccinated, the economy would not have opened.
Yes.
So it was the joint effort of the Mongolian people and the government that helped resolve the pandemic so effectively. So at this moment of great economic hardship, there's one less thing to worry about. So going forward, there'll be similar challenges. And when I talk to the President, the Prime Minister, and the Speaker, you can see that in their hearts, and they really want to alleviate economic hardship. So they all understand that at this point it's important to help the people who are more vulnerable. And the government doesn't have the room to support everyone. So some of the social programs will have to be amended, adjusted. And so the cooperation and understanding and wisdom of the Mongolian people will be very helpful and necessary to jointly solve multiple challenges. The government alone can't do it. So I would like to make a plea in your program for this discussion to happen in a constructive way so that there's burden sharing and more support for the poor who are really going through hardship, and an understanding that the government can't keep pumping money and worsening the economic hardship. It'll only worsen economic hardship for Mongolia.
Let's hope that this government and the Mongolian state understood it deeper. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
За хүн төлөвчтэй өнөөдөр манай факто нэвтрүүлгийн зочноор Олон улсын валютын сангийн Монголыг хариуцсан ажлын хэсгийн дарга хатагтай Ангана Банержи оролцлоо. Баярлалаа.
Thank you.